I worked for a nonprofit that relied on big donations from very wealthy donors. This meant cultivating relationships with some very, very wealthy people. One of the donors I was tasked with shepherding, let's call him D, invited me out for a weekend yachting off of or around near Catalina. I was excited. My partner gets seasick, so we never did boat trips, even though we live near the coast. Our first night out was beautiful, and we're all lounging on the deck of this gorgeous yacht talking about Erios and stuff. D mentions that he has this thin inflatable rollout panel that he tethers to the boat and lets float out in the water with about 100 inches or so of row. That people can use a sort of swim and as a platform. We get the idea that we should unfurl this thing and get into the darkness and experience the freakiness of it at night. I was equal parts frightened and curious, as was everyone else, so a group of 4 of us did it while 2 people stayed in the boat. We get the thing out, slide it into the water, and check the rope and push off. It's pretty instantly terrifying. You can see the dim lights on the boat. But after about 40 feet, it seems really, really far away, but it was undeniably awesome. We were chatting quietly to ourselves, but mostly we were being quiet and just talking in the weird mix of fear and awe of being so close in the water, in the middle of the night. We get to the point where the teller gets taut, and you can immediately feel the current tugging us away from the big boat. Which again, freaky, but we're confidently tied to the big boat. It's hard to see much of anything other than a few lights of Catalina. We're on the ocean side, not the bay side, even though we're not far from shore. I lie back flat on the platform, and everyone else does the same. The water wasn't rough, but it was moving, so you get rocked in random directions, splashes of water that lip over the edge, and everyone got wet. It was nice. When all of a sudden, the feeling of waves, kind of random and choppy, transitions to a very smooth swell, which makes us all gasp. We're rising quickly but smoothly. Everyone jolt upright. There's virtually no light from the moon. But it's enough for us to notice this gigantic fucking thing, just under the surface from the water from us. As soon as we notice it's already passing, and it says that it's fucking massive, we realize it's a massive whale moving right below us, maybe a foot or 2 down, and we're feeling the water displacement from it. No one makes a freaking peep. I immediately grab the tether and start pulling us in, and others start to help. No one makes a sound until we get back on the big boat, which no one leaves for the rest of the trip. It's all we talk about for the next 24 hours. Needless to say, now, I have a healthy fear of the ocean, especially at night. People are tiny, and the ocean is big. When I was 19, so in about 2007, my friend and I decided to take a cruise to celebrate becoming adults. The type of cruise we choose to take had a lot of alcohol, food, and a lot of cute guys. One night, I couldn't sleep. My friend passed out cold, and I, for the life of me, just couldn't drift off to sleep. I decided to go out to the deck and have a cigarette and take a walk to hopefully tire myself out. I found my headphones, cigarettes, and lighter, and left the room quickly. The halls were deserted, which didn't surprise me as it was 3 a.m., so I put my headphones in and blasted my favorite band at the time, Marianas Trench, and walked out of the hall to the upper deck. I felt an eerie feeling and looked back, feeling like someone was watching me. The hair on my neck stood up. I turned around quickly, but no one was behind me. I kind of laughed at myself and said, "Okay, Mandy, get it together." I walked up to the deck that was also deserted, and so I found a spot on a bench closer in front of the ship and sat down. I lit a cigarette and stared out at the ocean. As I smoked my cancer stick, for a few minutes, focusing on the reflection of the moon on the water, I suddenly felt someone sit beside me. I look over instinctively, and a guy about 40 or so was sitting beside me. I didn't want to talk to a stranger, so I looked back at the water. The guy beside me suddenly yanked out my earbud. I looked at him annoyed and said, "What the hell? You're pretty," he told me. Thank you," I replied awkwardly. "Are you here alone?" he asked. He moved closer as he did this. "No." I told him, feeling anxious with your boyfriend. He asked. I looked at him and my gut told me to lie. And I said, "Yeah, he's sleeping." He gave me a creepy side grin. Pretty girl like you. If you were my girlfriend, I'd be making these waves rock." He joked with a laugh. I looked at him horrified. "My name is Mohammed." He told me, inching closer again. I didn't respond. Instead, I put my earbuds back in, hoping that he would get the hint. Then I continued to smoke my cigarettes. A few seconds later, he yanked out my earbud again, and his both scared and pissed me off. A few seconds later, he yanked my earbud out again, and this ball scared and pissed me off. I stood quickly. "Do you like wine?" he asked. "I have wine in my room. You should join me for a glass." At this point, I was freaked out completely. "No, I don't drink wine, and I don't know you. Please leave me alone," I told him sternly. "So angry," he said with a chuckle. "He needs someone to clear that up for you." I started to walk away and head back to my room, and I got about 3 steps away when he grabbed my left wrist and stopped me. Before I could say anything, he grabbed me and held me in a huge hug, and I shit you not, I felt the bulge in his pants against my leg. "You smell so good," he said. I pulled away violently, while screaming, "Get the fuck away from me." I was able to get far enough away from him that I could run quickly inside. A security guard must have heard me scream because as I reached the door to get back inside, he let me in and stopped. I was crying from fear, and he asked me if I was okay. I managed to choke out what had happened, and he told me to stay inside as he rushed outside to do with John. A few minutes later, he came back inside and told me there was no man in the deck, that he may have gone back to his room. He had me fill out a report and give a detailed description of my attacker, and then he escorted me back to the room. The next morning, I told my friend about what happened, and she made me agree not to go out on deck alone anymore. She didn't have to tell me twice. The rest of the cruise, I was on edge, but I didn't see John again. The weird thing is that there was no Muhammad listed on the ship and no man watching. His description was ever found. According to the security guard who took my report, a few coworkers tried to find this man, as it didn't want him harassing any other woman. This scares me because I know how it happened, and I know he smelled and how greasy he seemed. I've been sailing all my life. I have somewhere around 6,000 sea miles, as well as years and years of inland dingy racing experience. The sea just does strange things sometimes. Wind against tide and underwater obstacles causing weird currents, and they create unnatural waves, and it starts to feel like the sea is just throwing water at you at random. The fog at sea at night really fucks up your senses too. Everything is quiet, and you can't see anything but the boat immediately around you. You keep looking for lights on other ships and listening for foghorns or the sound of engines in the distance, and your brain starts playing all manner of tricks on you. In a busy shipping lane, it's a serious business, and in a very real way, it could be life or death if you miss a ship that hits you and sinks you. You start to see lights everywhere around you. You start hearing engines gripping up on you. You stop your boat and cut the engine to see if we're hearing anything real, and you enter an even stranger world of sensory deprivation. It's eerie as hell. I just remembered a full solar eclipse we encountered as well. We saw one in the middle of the English Channel, and it was the strangest thing. There was a thin cloud, but the sun was visible through it. We were within the total eclipse zone, and we could see the shadow coming from miles away. It looked like the biggest, most angry storm I've ever seen. Generally, the darker clouds, the more it's going to hurt. This was darkness, as dark could possibly get during day. I talked to my dad about it afterwards, and we both felt the real uneasiness getting worse and worse as the nearer it got. Our bodies and subconscious were readying us for dealing with whatever really shitty, dangerous situation this was going to be. It was just like how people sometimes describe sending a ghost. A cold, chill, and a feeling really on edge. It really was like a ghost storm. A lot of sailing becomes instinctual after a while, and you get a feeling about what's coming from watching the clouds and waves off the horizon. The eclipse gave off every sign of an absolute nastiness, but passed without any real-world effect other than darkness. It was really, really creepy. I'm a geologist working at Death Valley National Park in Nevada. Over the last few months, we've been studying the geological formation dubbed Devil's Hole. Anyway, I've always found this place somewhat disconcerting. We have a vague idea of how it came to be and what makes it do what it does. But there's something else. Something off. The other day, we sent a little submarine drone to the water to see if we can map out the labyrinth cave system we know is there. But it has been completely inaccessible for decades. Also, we wanted to find out how deep it goes. The fact that an earthquake in China also could cause the water to rise so substantially at this spot in Nevada makes us think the water goes way deeper than preliminary estimates. The sub started to map the first 50 feet. It was tough to get a great signal. The mineral content of the water was really inhospitable to the system we use and how they communicate with one another. Not to mention the superheated water near the geothermal vent once you get more down, that could be enough to disable the drone entirely. At around 75 feet, the signal got really touchy. We'd have a few minutes of decent communication, but then it would cut out completely and leave us wondering if the sub had crashed or had been damaged beyond recovery. During the windows, when we would have time to move the drone, we explored from cave to cave and went deeper and deeper. The water was well above boiling. As the pressure increased, so did the temperature. The sub was rated up for 400 degrees for a short period of time, and the pockets of water were getting close to that maximum. We got to a relatively cool SPY, around 225 Fahrenheit, and we were told to stand by. Greg, who was operating the optical equipment on the drone, kept insisting that he was seeing flashes of light way below our position. I kept insisting that the equipment was malfunctioning and causing the flashes, but Greg wouldn't shut up about another sensor registering burst of heat at the same time of the flashes. We argued for a little while and the drone stayed in place. The water level in the hole started to rise. This wasn't unexpected. A surprisingly little amount of seismic activity anywhere in the world was enough to move the water over here. We kept bickering and didn't notice more flashes on the screen until much later when we analyzed the video. What finally knocked us out of our retrospective tantrums, though, was the way the water started to change color. It went from its normal shade of dull red, and Greg glanced at the screen and noticed the depth of the water in the cave chamber, originally as 36 feet, had changed to 353,000 feet. We knew there had to be an error. More flashes showed up on the screen as the water frothed and burbled on the surface. Then the feed went dead and stayed dead. Greg and I analyzed the video overnight. Everything we seen was there and was just as confusing. But then Greg saw a tiny spike in the audio track, right when the depth of the cave appeared to drop straight down. He ran it through a few filters to amplify the signal and clean it up. Then he played it back. We listened to it about 20 times in a row, despite hearing it perfectly the first time, corresponding with the massive increase in depth. And last word of the message, there was one more flash in the final video frame before the drone was lost. After Greg cleaned it up, we saw that was a single glowing red light. In June of 1948, multiple ships traversing the trade routes in Malacca, which is located between Sumatra, Malaysia, claimed to have picked up a series of SOS distress signals. The unknown ship's message was as simple as it was disturbing. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in shark room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. This communication was followed by a burst of indecipherable Morse code, then a final, grim message. I die. This cryptic proclamation was followed by a tomb-like silence. The crews that received the message were able to triangulate the source of these broadcasts and deduce they were likely emitting from a Dutch freighter known as the SS, or in Medan. A merchant ship known as the Silver Star was the closest to the presumed location of the Orang Medan, 400 nautical miles southeast of the Marshall Islands. Within hours, the Silver Star caught sight of the Orang Medan, rising and falling in the choppy waters of the Malacca Strait. As the merchant craft near the ill-omened vessel, the crew noticed that there was no sign of life on deck. The men on the Silver Star began to call out in motion to the Orang Medan. There was no response. The captain of the Silver Star assembled a boarding party. The brave men boarded the ship and made a grisly discovery. The deck of the vessel were little with corpses of a Dutch crew. Their eyes wide, their arms grasping at unseen assailants, their faces twisted into revolting visages of agony and horror. Even the ship's dog was dead, its once intimidating snarl frozen into a ghastly grimace. The boarding party found the captain's remains on the bridge, while his officers' cadavers were thrown about the wheelhouse and chart room. The communications officer was still at his post, as dead as the rest, his fingertips resting on the telegraph. All the corpses, according to reports, for the same terrified, wide-eyed expression as the crews on deck. The temperature outside was 110 Fahrenheit, but the search party reported feeling a cold chill in the air. The captain of the Silver Star decided that they would tether themselves to the Orang Medan and tow it back to port. But as soon as the crew attached the tow line, the Dutch ship noticed ominous billows of smoke pouring up from the number 4 hold. The boarding party scarcely had a chance to cut the tow line and made it back to the Silver Star before the Orang Medan exploded with such tremendous force that it lifted itself out of the water and swiftly sank. The crew watched the Dutch vessel disappear beneath the briny Das. So what exactly happened? Theories have ranged from pirates to the paranormal. The most widely believed claim is that the seawater could have entered the ship's hold, reacting to the perilous cargo to release poisonous gases, which then caused the crew to suffocate. At this point, the onrushing salt water might have reacted to the nitroglycerin, creating an explosive effect that was said to cause the ship's ultimate demise. The fact that there are no registration records for the Orang Medan remain to troublesome detail. There have been many claims that records have been eradicated by a savvy group of governmental conspirators due to the nature of the ship's mission. Nobody knows what happened to the SS Orang Medan except for the crew, who now rest at the bottom of the ocean. So last summer, my family and I went on a 7-day cruise to Alaska. It was really fun. I met some cool people and some not-so-cool people. To make things clear, I am an 18-year-old female, and I was 18 at the time. A couple days into the trip, my younger sister and I decided to walk around the ship, get familiar with it, and just hang out. We came across a long room with dividers set up, making small cubicles with pictures hung up inside them. They were family photos taken the day before, and we decided to look for ours. We found them, and were talking about them when an Indian man in his late 40s walks up to us saying how beautiful we look in the pictures. We were polite and flattered and said thank you and expected him to walk away. He didn't. He continued to compliment us, and we just said thanks. He finally left, and we thought nothing of it really. But then he came back with pictures of him and his wife. He began to show us the pictures, commenting on how great they looked together and asking us, "Don't we look good?" And we agreed, but we were starting to get annoyed. He then asked, "Is this your first cruise?" We replied yes, and he quickly asked, "What deck are you staying on?" We stupidly minus. He said we were on deck 16. Then we quickly added, "But we don't really know because we are still getting used to the ship. It's all very confusing, you know," adding a bit of a mild laugh enforcing a smile. What really annoyed me was the way he was looking at us. Every time we looked away, he glanced down at one of our chests. Depending on how he looked, depending on who looked away, I did not like the way he looked at my sister, since she was only 13 at the time. He then asked, "What is your stateroom number?" That's when I lost it and said, "We have to go." I grabbed my sister's hand and walked away quickly. But he started to follow. I got very scared, but gave up, and he stopped following us. We ran out there so fast and found our parents and told them everything. We saw him a few other times, but he never engaged. We still avoided him a lot, though. It was freaking creepy. Basically, we could have been raped that day or worse. So when I was 15, I went on a cruise with my family. I'm a fairly attractive girl, the type who went through puberty early. So at this point, I had pretty big breast. The wing that my mom and I stayed in had some housekeeper for the whole time. I guess he was assigned to that wing or something. So when I see him, he was super friendly, but just had this kind of off feeling about him. One day, I went down to our room by myself to change and just maybe relax a little. I saw him in the hallway. Nobody else was there at the time, and I waved and said hi, as did he. We started chatting a bit as I walked to my room, and it all seemed just polite and normal until we started chatting and commenting about my clothing and how it made me look. He then asked if someone was waiting for me back on the main deck, and me being a stupid 15-year-old said no. Nobody was waiting for me. Obviously, as soon as that came out of my mouth, I was like, oh my God, why did I say that? Like I mentioned earlier, my breasts are pretty noticeable at this point, so when I said I didn't have anyone waiting for me, his eyes went straight to my chest, very blatantly. Then looked back up at me. At this point, I was really freaking out and said, hey, I want to show you something. He then proceeded to grab my hand and start pulling me towards down the hall. I quickly blurted out that I'm actually thought that my dad was waiting for me upstairs. I aged my hand away and flat out sprinters to the other direction. I didn't tell my parents until years later because it just shook me up. But luckily, I didn't see the man for the rest of the cruise. The context is important to the story. We were on a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, with about 7 other men doing a shakedown in test cruise. We planned to be out for about 12 hours. It was the mid-1980s, and not as reliable weather prediction resources were out there. We get caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50-mile-per-hour range, just the sorts of a hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hailers and storm sails because one fellow on board who is the best sailor, since that the storm was almost on us. Otherwise, we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a call out on the radio. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, but when it passed, we would live. This was about 3 p.m., and although there were clouds over us, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 miles or so in any direction. If you are familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in the shallow or depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things off the seafloor. The sighting, we were all on deck, working lines, checking dam, etc. And the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often use the saying, the sea is confused. I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, and submerges again. It was like a thin man with a humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man, a human head, but his skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, then dove back under. So maybe you need to know a few things about me at the moment. I don't do drugs, I don't drink alcohol, and I have no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive. But my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had at the time about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, etc. all around the world. I was not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made a hesitant decision that I was not going to say anything. What could I say? I just saw a strange creature, take my word for it. The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as the flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get the D skipper for 00D qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there, in my life vest soaking wet, hooked onto the steel life frame, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors in USN Captain, with over 30 years of experiencing the surface navy, piped up and said, I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes and then went back under. Yeah, I saw it too. I said, no one else said that they'd seen it. Then we sailed back to the pier later that day, and we didn't speak of it again. I was on a deployment on an LHA standing port after watching the late night. We were out patrolling near Somalia, and of course, everything was pitch black. And even after you got used to the darkness, it was still very dark and eerie. There was this access hatch that normally is bolted down against the bulkhead. It gave access to steam pipes or something. I really didn't have much of an idea. That night, I was sitting on the capstan, drinking a Rip It. The ship store ran out of Red Bull a long time back, so now we drink these really weird knockoffs, and I noticed that the hatch was off, and the hole just revealed inky blackness. I thought whatever, and continued sitting and sipping. Then something caught the corner of my eye in the hatch's direction. I dismiss it as a shadow. Maybe a boat swings mate was walking the flight deck, checking for people sleeping on watch or something. I got up and started pacing around to give the impression I wasn't slacking and whatnot. I heard a tap and spun around and saw a shadow duck into the opened area of that hatch. It looked like a person's head ducking back into the area. Now, the hatch was probably only a little bigger than what you could stick your head and shoulders into. Naturally, I thought someone was messing with me and trying to scare me or something. So I wandered over there, brought up my tiny LED flashlight, and took a peek in there. Nothing but haze gray paint, shit, and some kind of plumbing. I brushed it off as lack of sleep and just my eyes tricking me. But that hatch area stayed open the rest of the cruise, and I was always wary of it in the back of my mind that something was there watching me as I was standing watch on the deck.